Good evening, Mr. Christian, Coach Holley. Thank you guys for coming in for episode 131 of the Path to Follow podcast. It's an absolute pleasure to have both of you guys in the studio today, and I'm excited to chop it up and catch up with you guys and hear how your year is going.
Well, Jake, thanks for having me and my old and dear friend Dan doing this. I guess that was one of the earlier podcasts. I don't even know what number it was, but I'm happy to be back. And I'm having a great year, actually. Transitioned back to doing what I wanted to do when I was a young man, probably around when I got out of the Navy, I guess at the age of 25 or 6 or whatever it was. I wanted to teach kids and had a family and things turned and wasn't really able to do that the way I wanted to because I needed to earn a little bit more money. And now finally, almost 40 years later, I guess I'm in year 39, I'm back to doing it again. So it's been a great blessing for me. I'm really enjoying the year. I'm a lot older than the parents and certainly the kids, but I'm trying to find my way with the new generation. So it's been great. Thank you.
Very good. Well, and nice to have Jake. Same thing. I could almost echo what Mr. Holley just said there. Thanks for having me. It's nice to see you, and certainly to see Timmy. We've been friends since 1985, and working together and talking. And I'm doing fine. I moved from in the 4.5 years since I retired in 2019, moved to Iowa City, and then moved to Des Moines, looking for a larger urban environment. And then had as I mentioned before, had a dear college friend pass away, and just decided to move back to where that I really liked the East Coast when I lived here. And so I'm still getting to teach, have a Dante class just finished one the past 6 weeks and then starting another one. So I'm still lucky enough to get a chance to hang out with the greatest story ever written, Dante's Divine Comedy. And so that's a little bit of a biased statement, but still accurate, I would think. So as Coach Holley and I were talking about, he was referencing the good book. And when I think about the good book, I think about Dante's Divine Comedy as well. It's just it's a sacred text. So anyway, I'm doing great. Happy to be on the planet and living in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. And got a Dante event coming up with some Dante and music coming up in November down in Chestertown, Maryland. So I'm happy to be here. So nice to see you all. So
awesome. Well, let me start us off with a, I guess, discussion question or topic that I've been thinking a little bit about. Do you think it's harder or more difficult to be a good teacher or a good coach?
Well, I guess and this is part of the Gilman thing, not necessarily unique to Gilman, but it's certainly a part of Gilman's history and tradition. I've always felt they were one and the same. You're just teaching a different discipline. If you're teaching, as my dear friend taught for years, kids how to play defense in basketball, that's, in my mind, not a whole lot different than trying to teach them that they need to put a semicolon between two main clauses. You're just teaching a different discipline. So I'm not sure it's harder. I think the coaching piece of it, if you're talking about coaching in athletics, is more emotional. I think the nature of sports and competition and maybe some of the value systems that we challenge ourselves and challenge the kids with in athletics, there's more of an emotional and psychological investment, and certainly on the part of the parents and therefore the children, there's more of that. I think the academic classroom is less emotional. I think the investment should be stronger. It is not always stronger. But in terms of being a good teacher, a good coach, I think the effort you put in both places is pretty much the same. And I've often had conversations in my years as an athletic director and meeting a lot of college coaches who were complaining about being on the road all the time and never being home and all that. And I said, well, why don't you just teach and coach in high school? Oh, no, I'm not a teacher. So, well, what are you doing in practice? You're teaching. Oh, I couldn't do it. Well, so I never understood that theoretically. And I think at a place like Gilman, the opportunity to be a teacher and a coach allows the students to see you in a different light and allows you to see the kids in a different light. And I think that's a pretty healthy environment because the reality is we're all trying to be mentors of some sort. So again, there are all kinds of ways to mentor, and I think as many venues as you get that opportunity, the better the relationship and more fulfilling and fruitful, in my opinion.
Yeah, I mean, Timmy, I mean, often, although Coach Holley and I haven't always agreed on everything, certainly, which would be kind of a a pathology if we did. But I would just concur and say, well said. I think that question is an interesting one, Jake, that you just asked, and I think it's really sort of a hard thing to measure. What does it mean to be a good teacher, a good coach? Because students aren't toasters, and so it's not like you are on an assembly line, which are not bad things. Obviously, toasters are good, and things that, you're not dealing with some sort of final end product that you can say, put A, B, C, and D together, and now you have a final product. You have the student that is always in process. So my sense has always been, in order to aim our best efforts at being as good a teacher, a coach as we can, the best way to do that is to, be it lacrosse, be it basketball, be it football, be it ninth grade English or your leadership class or Dante's Divine Comedy, is to always remember that first and foremost, you are a student first, always. And if we remember that we're always learning more and more about the subject and the sport that we love, if we are students first, I think that's a pretty potentially good way to be meaningfully effective, because then you are growing with your, and I'm sure, Jake, with you in the years now, I mean, as you move through your teaching time, the more you do it, and the more you are a student of everything that you invite the kids to pay attention to, you are growing in your relationship to that thing, just like the kids are.
Mm-hmm.
So, and certainly my conversations, Jake, the wonderful conversation I got a chance to have with you, I mean, you are clearly a student first, and I think that's going to continue to make you a fine young teacher, and eventually you'll be an older teacher.
Eventually. And I think, Dan, too, the other thing that, and you and I have had this discussion for years about, particularly when you're a younger teacher, you're really worrying about touching each child and making an impact with each kid. And we've talked about this. I mean, first of all, because human beings are human beings, they're going to be kids you don't connect with. Either they don't connect with you, or you don't connect with them, or vice versa, or mutually. And I think that, for a more veteran teacher, a person who's been there, done that a few times, I think that becomes something that you don't embrace it, but you accept it. And I think when you're younger, it's harder. The kids you don't reach, you get frustrated. Well, what's wrong with me? What's wrong with him? What's wrong? But I think, again, the reality is that you're not always going to connect with everyone. And I think once you, as a more seasoned teacher or coach, I think once you kind of get to that piece, that helps you be more effective as well, because you don't, in a lot of cases, it's not about you or the student. It's just about circumstances, or maybe there's a disconnect. One of the nice things about having multiple teachers and multiple coaches is that the student has options, right? Because one person may not naturally be a good fit for that person. So I think that's been helpful in making one more effective also, that, there are different strokes for different folks, and just having some peace with that is, just because the kid's assigned to your class or your team doesn't necessarily mean, there's going to be a meaningful relationship there. I mean, you hope for the best, as Dan said, you give it your best effort, but, it is what it is sometimes, to use that overused cliche.
I think that's a really good point, because that's something that I think I really struggle with. And I think it's because my ego sometimes gets in the way of, like, this student is drifting off in my class, or this student is not getting what what I've gone over a couple of times now. And I feel like I've done a pretty good job laying out the facts and the expectations and everything for the assignment, and they're not getting it. And for some reason, I mean, I think it's a little bit of the competitiveness, as an athlete and as a coach, like, you feel like you want to get everyone on the same page and succeed or get to a certain point. And I think I put that on myself sometimes. Sometimes it's like a personal thing, is like, why is this student not understanding what I'm trying to do here? And you're exactly right. And it's something you have to accept, I think, which I'm trying the more that I teach, to accept that not every student is going to be, an all-star or understand or connect with you on a certain level.
That's very well said. And you are, at the end of the day, the kid who's struggling in class, what's that old wonderful adage, try to be kind to everybody you meet, because everybody you meet is fighting a very difficult battle. And what that child, male, female, person, whatever, we don't know what is going on. Oftentimes he or she may have had to climb over an intoxicated parent as he was walking out the door to go to school. I mean, the struggles that everybody has struggles, and, that kid that you're trying to reach. And because you accept the fact that you're not going to reach everyone doesn't mean that you've given up on that person. It just means that you're allowing that person to be who he or she is. And ironically or paradoxically, I guess, that the fact that you almost stop trying to think that you're going to reach everyone actually creates potentially a meaningful space where that resistant kid might actually move a little closer to what you're inviting him to do.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think too. There's no substitute for experience, right? The more, Jake, and you'll have this hopefully great blessing that Dan and I've had. I think the more you do this, the more, and this is again an overused cliche, but the more tools in your toolkit. I mean, you deal with so many different kinds of people and situations that eventually, I don't know how long it is, but it takes a while. They start to repeat themselves. You've been there, done that. And I think and Dan could attest to this more than I, because he's already made this step. I'm inching toward it, or maybe not inching anymore, maybe moving a lot quicker than I used to. But I think when you decide that you're tired and you don't want to do it anymore, it's because things do start to repeat all the time. And you feel like, again, for Dan and I have been friends a long time and taught together. Well, you had this problem in 1990 and we solved it. Well, now it's 2010, the same problem again. I don't want to do this again. We did that already. And I think eventually people say, I've had enough. And I believe, whether it's true or not, and again, Dan is ahead of me in this, but I really do believe that education is a young person's business. Or the old line is, we get older and the kids stay the same age. And I am finding, again, as I've gotten more senior, as I said earlier, older than the parents and a lot older than the students. And, that ability to connect and even just using references. I said in class last week, I used a reference to Hogan's Heroes. And maybe Jake, you don't know that reference, but Dan knows it. And I quoted Sergeant Schultz, whose tagline was, "I know nothing.
I know nothing.
Nothing." And the kids looked at me like I had just come from Mars. Like, what is that? I mean, I try to explain, well, it's Hogan's Heroes, 60s. I think it was early mid 60s when Hogan. And to them, it's history. I mean, obviously to me and to Dan and people from that time, it's life. but I think that part of teaching, particularly, Dan and I were blessed to teach English for a long time, like you, Jake. Part of that opportunity in teaching English is you tell a lot of stories, or certainly I did. Mm-hmm. and some of my references are off, and my children, my three daughters will tell me often, Dad, no one knows what you're talking about. That's gone. It's old. Let it go. So anyway, we're trying, like Dan says, you're always trying to be a student. I guess eventually my student days don't coincide with the current student days. So we're trying to find some middle ground there.
So have you had a pretty good time being back in the classroom after being away for a couple of years, being back in the English department?
Yes, I've enjoyed it. I think the time away made it refreshing for me. And again, someone like Dan who did it for every year consistently, I think it can wear you out. But this year's the first time I've taught in 4 years. And I'm going to coach for the first time in 4 years, or 5, maybe longer than that, whenever 2017 was. That's 6 years. I'm going to coach a little bit. So it's kind of new again. Now, maybe I'll wear down quicker than I used to, maybe 10 or 20 years ago. But I really have felt energized. Even the mundane things, the writing comments and grading papers I have not felt they were mundane. It's kind of fresh for me again. Again, I don't know how long it'll last, but I hope it lasts for a little while. But yes, I'm really happy. I was thankful for the opportunities to do the other things I've done in my career, but this is really what I wanted to do. And I think I'm at a stage in life now where it fits. I mean, earlier in my life, it didn't fit as much because, you know, I had other responsibilities, but now those responsibilities aren't there. And I'm just, you know, I get up early and excited about doing it. And, you know, so I look forward to it. Yeah.
Well, I think the podcast setting is the perfect place for both of you guys because of how many stories that you have from Gilman, from teaching, all the knowledge that you both have from literature and reading for so long that, you know, I'm sure that's why you're such legends in the Gilman community, is because you could just tell stories, like you said. You can just, you know, stand in front of students and, you know, give them lessons through your own experience.
Would have been harder, Dan, I think, if we were math teachers, but although maybe.
Well, I mean, the narrative of a geometric proof has some power, I think. You know, so solving for X. Yeah, but what's that great line? Elie Wiesel at the beginning of one of his novels. You know, Jake, the guy that wrote Night.
Yep.
You know, at one of his other novels, I can't remember the title of it. That God created man because he loves stories. And that's a pretty that seems to, you know, stories are, we kind of even in the book of Genesis, right? I mean, you know, God created with words. You know, he didn't go out to, you know, and God said, "Let there be light." He didn't go out to Target and buy a creation kit. You know, I mean, he used words to build things. So that's a good thing.
So Mr. Christian, what has it been like for you rereading Catcher in the Rye? So I'm reading it again for probably the third time I've ever read it, but I read it, I think, in high school and then once in college, and now I'm getting ready to teach it for the first time ever. And you've already read through it again recently. What was that experience like?
It was, you know, it was, again, and I know it sounds sort of hokey and stuff, but it was a gift. You know, I mean, because spending time with Holden again is, I mean, Holden Caulfield was after, and Mr. Holley remembers this too, when Mark Moskowitz came and about that film Stone Reader, you know, that documentary.
Yep.
And that line that I heard in that film that really opened up so many things for me. It's like, you know, it confirmed something I'd already known, you know, that as long as my book is somewhat alive in you. And Holden Caulfield, Catcher in the Rye was the first thing I ever read back in the mid 80s, where when I was reading it, I literally, and it sounds, you know, kind of crazy, but I was reading it and I stopped at about, you know, wherever I stopped, and it felt so much to me like what Holden was about to do was say, "Hey, Dan, I'm sorry, I'm being rude. Let's talk about you for a while. I just been talking about myself." And like, it brought me in. So this time Holden, you know, I sort of started back with that film back in 2022 or 2002. So that's a gazillion years ago, that stopped thinking of Holden Caulfield. And certainly since we're talking about this novel, stop thinking of Holden as the protagonist of the novel, but rather thinking about him as our wounded brother. And he is alive every time you turn to page one. And what I noticed this time, and I tried to keep my, you know, that, remember Coach Holley, this image that came from a gazillion years ago on the football field about, you know, you want to see the ball and see the person you're guarding simultaneously. So you have your, you know, metaphorically, you have your big eye on the ball and your little eye on the man.
Correct. Yeah.
And I think you have to apply that to the book. You kind of have your big eye on the plot and your little eye, which is important, little eye on the repeating patterns that keep coming up. And I was struck this time, Jake, by like really struck. And I'm not sure exactly why. I'm going to have to let it simmer for the next 20 or 30 years. But why Holden refers to his inner struggles and his inner pain. He doesn't say that he's lonely ever. He says that he's lonesome.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm just really curious. And Jake, maybe, or Mr. Holley, you have some thoughts too about this. Yeah. What do you think? I think there's a meaningful distinction there in that difference between being lonesome versus not merely, but being lonely. And Holden must say 6 or 7 times how lonesome he is. And I think that paints a pretty powerful picture in terms of giving us a glimpse into the very nature of his hurt. So it's been meaningful, but that's what I have been particularly struck by this time. And I didn't laugh as often this time, because I used to laugh all the time because Holden's hilarious. I mean, He's just so extreme. He's hyperbolic all the time. This time, because I had my little eye on lonesomeness, his lonesome quality, I didn't feel like laughing as much because every time I wanted to laugh about the way he was being funny, it was also a picture of how hurt he is.
Yeah, I'd never really, I guess when I first read the book, I had a sense that the book was about loneliness or lonesomeness. But I'm halfway through, and I haven't started it really with my students yet. That's next week, but I'm halfway through on my own, and I'm understanding that concept a lot more. I think maybe because I read this summer as part of a book club, because you need to have a book club for The Infinite Jest, and that was one of the hardest books I've ever read. It took me since maybe March. I think we started Infinite Jest to just last week. And I still, I skimmed a little bit, and I still have a little bit more to go with it. But our book club finished up, and that book it's just a meditation on loneliness and addiction. And I feel like I've been able to understand those ideas a little bit on a deeper level after finishing that, because all of the characters in that book, it's set at a tennis academy and a halfway house, and it's all about addiction and the feeling that no one is really understanding who you are or seeing you. And I'm getting the same sense through Holden Caulfield.
Wow.
No one is really seeing him.
That's really remember even when he's one of the times he's wandering around New York, he would come to an intersection, and before he crossed, he would say to himself, he would talk to Allie. And he would say, "Please don't let me disappear." And then he'd get across the street and he'd sort of thank him, and Allie is dead. But yeah, that he's not seen. That's very, very well. And the cross-pollination that you just did there wonderfully with Foster Wallace's novel is a really, really, that's a really rich, that's a rich connection, it seems to me. I mean, my goodness. Yeah. There's a really good essay by Wallace about the spiritual experience of watching Roger Federer play tennis.
Yeah. It's interesting because we talk so much in this book club about how tennis is such a lonely sport because you're out there on your own, and even though you have coaches and training, you're the only person you can blame when you lose a tennis match. It's such a addicting sport too. I mean, once you start playing tennis and really getting into it and watching it, I know so many people who, that's the only sport they watch. They just watch tennis all day long. Right. So there's something to that. I know David Foster Wallace was a big tennis player back in the day, but I think he uses tennis in this book because it's so addicting and lonely, and it adds to the whole message of the book.
That's very well said. And even tennis keeps score with love.
Mm-hmm.
So,
So I'd be interested to ask you guys. I mean, we in the ninth grade, Catcher in the Rye was a summer reading 4 or 5 years ago. So when I was teaching it before, and so we spent the first week or two with it. So I'm familiar with the text. I had a recent conversation with another teacher who happens to share my ethnicity, and he felt, and I hadn't thought about it, but I think this is where the world is, certainly in the United States today. He didn't like the novel because he felt it had no connection to the African American community, and I hadn't thought about that. But I think in today's political culture, this is a. I mean, I teach this senior elective with Joe Valentine White, which has been around since 1987 because I was there at the inception, where this notion of different voices and the recognition of different voices has become such a controversial in a lot of places. I mean, this senior class that I'm doing with Joe Valentine White. I mean, if we were in Florida, we couldn't teach it. So, I mean, there's a lot of controversy out there about voice and perspective. So I was wondering what you guys thought about that. And when this teacher said to me, I don't know why Catcher in the Rye came up, but it came up, and he said, "Boy, I really don't like that book," and for the reasons I just stated. I'd be interested in your perspective on that.
Jake, you want to go ahead? I mean,
Well, I think you're right. I think that is sort of what's going on in a lot of English departments right now, is trying to find different voices to fill the curriculum. And I've tried to do that a little bit with my classes too, because you want, like we said, for every student to see themselves or be seen by what they're reading, and feel like they have have something they can cling on to when they're reading something that makes them feel like they're connected to the class. So I understand that a lot. But I also feel like so many of the themes and the major ideas that we talk about, and even a book like Catcher in the Rye, I feel like the idea of loneliness, which we were just talking about, it's universal. And something I try to focus on in my English classes is just universal themes. Like, no matter where you're from, what your race is, your ethnicity, your background, I feel like in every book, maybe not every book, but in most books in my curriculum, I'm hoping that the students can cling on to the universal human themes and talk about those ideas. Not to say that we don't talk about, race and gender and ethnicity and other important concepts, but I think the ones that I really, value in my class are the universal ones. And I think Catcher in the Rye, I think there are multiple universal ideas that I'm only halfway through on this reading, but I feel like anyone can relate to the feeling of loneliness sometimes.
yeah, I mean, that well said. And Mr. Holley sort of said, I mean, it's a challenging, I don't know, situation for people you want to be able to read, and certainly because so much of the canon that has been recognized as, quote, valuable has often excluded the voices of people of color. And so now there's an awful lot of important catching up to do in terms of making sure that, everybody's, backgrounds are recognized as being vehicles of light. Maybe an interesting exercise would be to have someone read Catcher in the Rye, and then for like a final paper or something, pick a key moment in Catcher for Holden, and then write an essay on what Holden Caulfield really needs at this moment would be to read Their Eyes Were Watching God. And so that might be a way to bridge the sort of culture gap by bringing a fresh voice to Holden's experience, because the fiction of Holden's life and the fiction of Janie, right? Is that Tim?
Janie, yep.
Is that right? That great line, my goal was I wanted my granddaughter to eat of a sweeter berry picked from a higher tree.
Right. Yep.
And so maybe that would be just like you had done, Jake, with the cross-pollination with David Foster Wallace and Holden. Maybe there would be meaningful ways for people. And again, it would be more work for the students, but that's okay. I mean, they could limit their screen time. They got more time to read. That maybe they could create an encounter where Holden would meet a fiction, because Holden loves to read, right? I mean, he's a big reader. So that might be something to ponder.
Well, I think there would be a lot of value in that, and I know that in some classes people are attempting that. I'm doing. I think, Dan, we talked about this a little bit. I'm doing something for the first time ever with the grade. I think I'm the only ninth grade teacher still teaching To Kill a Mockingbird. So we're still doing To Kill a Mockingbird in my class. But what I've decided to do this time, and again, in terms of, so you take a quality like being lonely, and what's the perspective of a person who's come from this background and culture in being lonely, and someone who's come from a completely different background. I mean, it's still, like Jake said, it's a human quality, but it may have a different look to it from a different angle. So what we're doing now is we read part one. Actually, we just finished part one of To Kill a Mockingbird, so we haven't gotten to the trial yet. So it's just out there, right? Cecil Jacobs is calling people names, and so Atticus is trying to prepare the kids for a tough road ahead. So we stopped there, and then some ninth grade teachers are teaching Between the World and Me by Ta-Nehisi Coates, which is a very provocative kind of militant point of view book, and so we're going to read now. The book is divided in two parts as well. So we're going to read part one. We're going to stop To Kill a Mockingbird, go to part one of Between the World and Me, and then make some comparisons and go back to part two and finish the novel, To Kill a Mockingbird, and then come back to finish Coates' book and see if we can cross-pollinate, to use your term, Dan, and maybe try to find out, so Harper Lee writes from a feminine 1960, where she grew up in the South, her perspective, and then obviously Coates is younger. Coates was born in '75, and he grew up here in Baltimore. So, it might be interesting to see if Jem and Scout meet Brother Coates somewhere on the street corner and see if the kids can find some commonality. And I think that's part of the great thing about literature in general. And Jake's point about human kindness and human qualities and trying to empathize, which is what Atticus is trying to teach the kids every day of their lives, to be empathetic with other people. So it's hard sometimes to be empathetic if there's not exposure. So maybe the more and more we can expose people and try to figure out why Santiago in The Old Man and the Sea, he's a Cuban guy, right? And why Coates in Northwest Baltimore, who's a black man in Northwest Baltimore, and maybe why Holden, who's a preppy kid from a family of some means, white preppy kid from means, how are they connected? Because we're all connected. And I think part of the problem in the world, of course, is we see our differences a whole lot more than we see our similarities, which is a cause for a lot of division, not only here in the United States and in our town, but around the world, clearly with recent events. So we'll see if we can shine a different light on the same subject and see if the lights blend.
That's a great. It just sounds like a really great way to honor the fact that books are alive and interact with one another. That just sounds like a great present. I wondered if I'd had this book recommended to me about 3 years ago that I read, and you all may have heard of it. It's called The Body Keeps the Score.
Oh yeah, I've heard of that. Yeah.
Yeah, it's about the role of trauma in people's lives, and obviously they're finding out more and more, certainly for African Americans, in terms of the whole generational trauma. Even people that are suffering almost the impact that trauma can have on a person's genetic code and DNA. And I wonder if you go back through post-traumatic stress and see what the quote characteristics of trauma are, that if we wouldn't be able to find similarly that Holden Caulfield is exhibiting the PTSD given the loss of his brother, and Bigger Thomas's experience.
Right.
that the trauma are obviously not the same. But on some level, there may be trauma intersection as well.
Yeah,
So,
I think again we have more in common than we don't, and trying to get that message across. I mean, the whole notion of being empathetic, which we talk about character education in a place like Gilman. Again, not uniquely Gilman, but we talk about character education. Well, I mean, what does that really mean? I mean, I think it. When I was a student here, we were talked to a lot about. Um, making the world a better place and serving the community and leaving the world better than you found it and all those wonderful ideas that, are hard to live. But certainly the effort to try to find commonality just to realize that, life is hard. And I think you said this earlier, Dan, we're all trying our best to get through it. And people are struggling as much as we are. And the more we can kind of reach that hand out, either actually or metaphorically or symbolically, to say, hey, I know you're going through it, Holden. Hey, Bigger, yeah, I know you're going through it. We're all going through it. So let's try to go through it together. I mean, certainly the strength in numbers makes the journey a little bit more doable than being lonesome or lonely. And that's a lot of Holden's issue. He's got nobody to connect with, right? And that's Bigger's issue. I mean, if you know that character, Bigger Thomas from Native Son, I mean, he becomes a sociopath because he's got no social or human connection of any value, and he essentially loses his mind. So I think these are common themes in the human condition, and one of the nice things about teaching English is that you can talk about these different things, and really in terms of if someone were to say, and I think Gilman has to go through this like all schools, you're evaluated on what you teach and how do you teach character ed. Well, one of the ways you teach character ed is you talk to kids about books and people's condition and how they can affect that and help people get along. And by the way, I would say this is an old school way of thinking. I think now with the NIL and money and getting scholarships and getting a contract, I think that some of this is being lost. I would offer that in coaching, that there's a similar theme of teaching empathy, how to win, how to lose, how to be a good teammate, how to handle adversity of any sort, whether it be an injury or, coach yelled at me or, whatever it is. If I fumble the ball, all those things that athletes go through, how can we find ways to help kids through that journey too? Because for when you're 15 years old, fumbling a ball or missing a shot or letting a goal in. I mean, that's as traumatic for that child at that age. It doesn't probably mean as much to us anymore, but it means a lot to that kid at that age in that circumstance as any other kind of quote unquote tragedy. They just don't have the perspective yet to realize it's just a minor bump in the road. But at that moment, it's a big deal. So how do we help kids in that kind of human struggle to get better?
it's a curious paradox, isn't it, on some level, right? I guess that in terms of institutions, I mean, we all, spend a lot of years at Gilman and stuff, but the paradox is that the ultimate goal of the truly educated person who gets his Gilman diploma, that the goal is not ultimately to bleed blue and gray. The ultimate goal is to bleed red better and with empathy.
Right. Right. And I think, again, this human beings are complicated. Institutions of human beings are complicated, right? So this our push to be blue and gray and to be Gilman and all those things that we talk about. I mean, I'm living proof that certainly I've been hearing it for 52 years now, and it's a part of who I am. But I think as I've gotten older, the more I have felt a kinship with all kinds of people, and I've said this before, all those years as an athletic director and coaching, and I certainly wanted Gilman to win, because that was our goal, one of our goals, and I think we were striving to have kids do that. That's a measurement. It's not the entire measurement. Dan, you and I've talked about this for eons, but it's certainly a measurement of what you're trying to accomplish. And we wanted to win, but I always felt. I mean, I was partial to the kids in blue and gray, but the kids in black and orange, and the kids in gold and royal blue and gold and all those other maroon and white, all those other colors. I mean, I wanted them to have a meaningful experience as well, in my heart of hearts. And obviously, there's when you're coaching your own kids, you really don't have a whole lot to do with the other kids from the other teams, but you do in some sense. I mean, to have some empathy if you happen to be on the quote unquote good side of a score, trying to make sure the game doesn't get out of hand and people aren't humiliated, and try to tell your kids to help that kid up. All those little things, I think, that shows, you're our opponent, right? You're not our enemy. And I felt strongly when we built new scoreboards around here years ago. I felt strongly that it should say Gilman or Hounds, whatever we put up, and guests, right? Because these people are our guests. They're not our opponents. They're so in that sense. So I think school life. And again, my prayer, although it's certainly sounding like an old curmudgeon, I guess at this point, but I hope that the money and the affectations of athletic success today, I hope we don't lose some of the other stuff that I think was a part of school life. But I'm afraid that maybe as times have changed, that's inevitable. That seems to me.
I think we're fighting against the clickbait of social media where people see the videos of the team that's not really acting with good sportsmanship, or the coach who's like, you're seeing all that on social media because it gets the most clicks, because people watch those videos the most. And I think a lot of the club stuff that's going on, I just see the lacrosse world, but a lot of it is to make money, but a lot of it is a means to an end. Like, we're going to get your kid into a college. And I think like a place like Gilman is trying to instill these character values through sports and teach, boys how to become men through sports. I think that's it's a different front of all the other things that are going on in the world, which are not as, are sort of toxic, I think, in my opinion.
Yeah, I mean, that's a pretty good word choice, toxic. And it's okay to recognize the people from McDonough and Calvert Hall and Loyola or whatever, that they are our guests. They are not the enemy. And you can still play hard, but you're playing. Coach Holley, we've talked about this a lot too, right? I mean, the ultimate goal is to play. Mm-hmm. You signed up to play, so play with other human beings, as opposed to against. And almost comes down to the proposition is the preposition that we're playing with. And that's okay. And if you lose, that's not a character flaw.
Yeah, and I think the notion of what competition truly is, as we've been saying throughout this discussion, I mean, it's complicated. And how hard do you try to win? And again, if that is the goal or one of the goals, do you do whatever it takes to win? I mean, keeping that all in context, I think is challenging, because the world says that the guy with the most has the most, and I'm not sure, having chosen a career in education like the four of us who are sitting here, well, we don't have the most in terms of dough. I can tell you that. I mean, I assume that's true, but we might have the most in terms of other things, or the most for us, and so. This idea, I mean, Dan, we've had teams over the years who were good and had great records, and teams with not so great records. I can recall coaching several teams who had it didn't have a lot of wins. I mean, well under 500. And my hope for those teams, and I, a little bit of a Pollyanna here, I guess, but my hope for those teams, that looking back on the experience, that it was as fulfilling for them as the teams that won games, right? And you can have some teams that win championships where it wasn't a great experience, but how do we measure, or what should our goals be when we're trying to teach kids, quote unquote, how to win or how to compete, and that can be academically as well. I'm inclined if a child comes to me and says, "Look, I want to talk to you about my grade." I'm inclined to say, "Well, I really don't want to talk about your grade. I mean, because the grade is arbitrary. What I'd like to talk to you about is what you wrote or how you wrote it. I mean, those kinds of things. Or let's talk about, why you didn't see the character in the book maybe the way I saw it. Let's have that conversation." But again, I think we're geared to, and maybe it's a vestige of capitalism, that we're kind of geared to production. And I hope life isn't that black and white or cut and dry. I mean, it's complicated, but I think it's complicated in a good way, particularly if you've lived a fulfilled life. So,
Well said.
Well, guys, thank you for your words. It's been a fun discussion. Mr. Christian, it's great to see you. Thank you for coming in on Zoom. And did you get a chance to listen to some Hosier's new album that's based off?
I apologize because I have that there, and I'm going to take a listen today. I'm going to find some time today because I appreciate you sending me that potential Dante music. So thank you. I will. I haven't forgot. I got it right there. It's just things have been a little hectic here. But
I mean, Hosier is significantly out of your music genre. I mean, that's really going. I'm impressed that you even would be willing to think about listening to that.
Well, I mean, I appreciate that, Coach Holley. I'm not sure that your tone is as genuine as we would like, but yeah, I'm willing to acknowledge that there are one or two other musicians besides Harry Chapin. Yeah, I'm really, my world's getting bigger. I mean, I eat broccoli now, so there you go.
And and certainly as your world gets bigger, your chipping and putting has improved as well. I mean, I've noticed it with great admiration.
Exactly. I mean, I can sometimes drain 10 or 12 footers to save an 8 or 9.
Well, that's always my hope, that if you have an 8 or a 9, then my 6 might win.
Exactly right. It's about playing.
It's about playing.
It's about playing.
I just want to play a little less in the game of golf than you do.
Very well said. Well, Jake, thank you for having me, Mr. Holley. Thanks for sharing some time.
Mr. Christian, always a pleasure. We'll be seeing you soon, I'm sure, before the weather gets a little too chilly for us to hit the ball around.
No, absolutely. I mean, I'm sure we'll find some 68-degree high temperature where we'll be able to go low, as the golfers like to say. So,
go low. Yeah,
love it.
Always the. What's your line? The ball is in Hope's court.
The ball is in Hope's court. Unfortunately, since I've never had an original thought, but that line is from Josephine Humphrey's novel, The Fireman's Fair. But I love that line. The ball is in Hope's court. I'm in. Sign me up. Flip a tee.
That's a great way to end it, Jake. Right there. The ball's in Hope's court.
Ball's in Hope's court. Thank you both for coming in. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Jake.
Thank you, Dan. Please see you, Cesare. Take care. Thanks.
Thank you, Cesare.
See you guys.